Who can invade whom? Gauss's principle of competitive exclusion highlights the symmetry or asymmetry in any competitive struggle. Your firm is in a very weak position if your rival can enter your space, but you can't enter his. This, incidentally, is the organizing idea behind the world domination board game Risk. If you're in this position, don't stay there. You must find a niche, a way of earning your living in a different way. If you can't do this, and the business is still profitable, sell it before it is too late. Look at what happened to the British motorcycle industry in the 1970s. Honda had two unique markets that the British motorbike makers couldn't enter. It had the large Japanese market and the market for small bikes. Clearly these overlap, but they are conceptually separate and, outside Japan, physically separate too. At first, the British had a separate market, that for larger bikes. But the relationship between the British and Honda was asymmetrical. The British couldn't enter Honda's markets because British bikes were designed to be big and powerful and were too expensive to downscale. But Japanese bikes were designed to use modular components and to be capable of upscaling. Honda's bikes were also cheaper and better value, even after the cost of transport and distribution, which was another reason for the asymmetry. Before the Japanese entered the British bike market, the British industry might have felt secure. Even after the Japanese entered, did it matter? They were only selling toy bikes, often to people who'd never bought a bike before. If the British bike makers had read about Gauss's protozoans, they would have known their fate. Only by developing a unique niche, which the Japanese couldn't enter, as BMW did with its ultra-comfortable bikes for big bottoms, would the British have survived. By 1980, their bike industry was all but dead. Of course, if your firm can invade and the competitor can't, you should. You can feel very confident of the outcome. Bistability is better than coexistence. Gauss's research makes the interesting contrast between bistability and coexistence. Coexistence is real competition, where either can invade the other. Bistability is when they can't. It's illusory competition. Bistability implies that two populations are not really competitors. They are both excluded from each other's domain. This is very common in business. An industry may appear to be competitive, yet each competitor has different customers, different distribution channels, or some other differentiating factor that has barriers around it. Within each segment, different firms can enjoy high market shares and high profits. Whenever you see an industry that is very profitable, like high-end consulting, you find a market where competitors are very specialized and where each has a high share of its own niche. Smart players will keep it that way. On the other hand, a market characterized by many coexisting competitors is likely to be one in competitive stalemate. No one will have the edge. Market share will have little value. Here, the struggle between competitors for customers makes every supplier a loser. The only hope within a coexistence game is to recognize it for what it is, and for all the competitors to signal to each other that they will live and let live. Price wars, aggressive marketing campaigns, or indeed vigorous activity of any kind, all of these must be avoided like the plague. To break out of a coexistence game requires the development of a segment where dominance can be exercised. And we are back to the fundamental point, that you need to be different. breaking out at coexistence and into buy stability. If you're in a coexistence market, it may be possible to break out and make your own buy stable market. The airline industry is, in general, a good example of coexistence. Except where regulation restricts the number of competitors on any route, consistent profits are hard to come by. Without regulation, each airline can invade the other's customer base. Each innovation, such as free drinks in the cheapest class, can easily be copied. Only fare structures of Byzantine complexity keep the airlines from making losses, and fares are becoming increasingly transparent as sophisticated customers use the Internet to search for the lowest fares. Yet even in the airline industry, it's possible to escape coexistence by doing something radically different. Take Southwest Airlines. It doesn't follow the typical hub-and-spoke system based around large airports. It avoids long routes, in-flight feeding, and ticketing bags to other destinations. It offers one class, frequent flights between a few carefully selected cities, short check-in times, automated ticketing, and low fares. It has a standard fleet of 737s, cutting maintenance costs and delays. It encourages direct payment, cutting out commissions to travel agents. It appeals to a particular type of traveler who appreciates the trade-offs that it makes. Other airlines can't copy Southwest. There's not room for two such airlines on any of its routes, and the competitors are not set up for this approach anyway. Southwest has therefore created a buy-stable market and can enjoy high profits despite having low prices. The trick is to have higher utilization rates than is possible under coexistence. The danger of having one key to success in an industry. Gauss's test tube wars revealed one further fascinating fact. If scarcity in one single resource like food or air was the issue, one species always became dominant. Coexistence or bistability only worked if more than one limiting factor was relevant. The corporate equivalent? When competition only proceeds via one variable. If price is all that matters, the low-cost corporation is bound to win. If quality reigns supreme, the supplier perceived to have the highest quality will dominate. If innovation is all that matters, as in some fashion markets, then the trendiest will inherit the earth. The punchline? If you're in a market where there is only one dimension of competition, and you're not the best on that dimension, you should create a separate segment where another dimension matters. If you can't do this, and the market is unprofitable for you, as it probably will be if you're measuring the profitability properly, then you should quit. Differentiation is a set of actions to take you to unique land. Differentiation is not quite the same as specialization. It is actually more fundamental. Differentiation implies that you don't just specialize. To differentiate successfully, you find the market space where the ratio of your productivity to that of your best rival in that space is highest relative to all the other areas where you could specialize. And then, make the way you earn your living as different as possible from that of anyone else. You actually accentuate the differences between you and the nearest competitor until you have arrived at a unique niche. Differentiation is not a description of a state. It is a set of actions to increase differences. Think how you could further differentiate your firm from its closest competitor. In each area where you face a different closet competitor, along each of the following 4 dimensions. 1. Customer type. 2. Type of product or service. 3. Geography. 4. Stage of value added. Extend the distance between yourself and your closest rival until it is clear that there really isn't a closest rival. Then, you've arrived at the happy country, unique land. Summary. Gauss's principle of survival by differentiation tells us that we cannot expect to prosper if we make our living in the same way, at the same time, in the same place as another similar competitor. Gauss's principles of competitive exclusion say that if one species can invade another, but the other can't reciprocate, then the former will end up dominant. Therefore, you should not enter or stay in business where you can't enter some of your competitors' markets, but it can enter all of yours. On the other hand, if you can invade a rival who can't invade you, go ahead. Competitive exclusion also implies that spurious or illusory competition can exist where each player is excluded from the other's domain. This is called bi-stability and is usually a happy situation. Not so good is coexistence, where each player could invade the other. Gauss's third and final message is that when a single resource is of paramount importance, one species, the one best at cornering that resource, will end up dominant, and the other species will be wiped out. There is a perfect analogy in business because in some markets, only one purchase criterion matters, and the firm that is best at meeting that criterion will dominate. If you are in such a market and are not best at what is most important to customers, either find a segment where the main purchase criterion is different and you can meet it best, or else quit. The idea of ecological niches says that there is an amazingly large number of ways of making a living, and that the ideal position is to have your own niche where no one else makes the same living in the same way at the same time. Then, there are no competitors. You are unique. Action implications. 1. Differentiate. Specialize. Put all your energy and resources into areas where you are substantially different from any rival. 2. Systematically increase the degree of difference from your closest rival along the 4 dimensions of product and or service type, customer type, geographic market, and stage of value added. Aim to become unique, that is, to have no rivals. 3. Get out of business where a competitor can invade you but you can't invade it. 4. If you can invade a competitor but it can't invade you, go ahead and invade. 5. Avoid business where there is coexistence, where everyone can snatch each other's customers. If you're in a coexistence market, turn it into a bi-stable one by finding a distinctive approach that customers like and competitors can't imitate. If you can't do this and are stuck with coexistence, make the most of it by trying not to step on competitors' toes. And finally, 6. In any business where a single purchase criterion, such as price or quality or service, is all that matters, and you are the best at satisfying that criterion, go all out for dominance. Widen the gap between yourself and the competitors on that criterion. If you are in such a business, yet are not the best at meeting the key criterion and cannot become the best at it, then find another segment, within or outside your current segment, where the purchase criterion plays to your strength. If you can't find such a segment, exit. Chapter 4. On Evolutionary Psychology. Behind every successful man stands a surprised woman. Marion Pearson, wife of Canadian Prime Minister. Meet the Flintstones in the office. One fascinating new scientific discipline that evolved in the last third of the 20th century is evolutionary psychology, a mix of genetics, anthropology, paleontology, neuropsychology, and social psychology. A form of neo-Darwinism applied to the study of human behavior, evolutionary psychology has some controversial but fascinating messages for business. Punctuated equilibrium. In 1972, two evolutionary biologists, Stephen Jay Gould of Harvard University and Niles Eldredge of the American Museum of Natural History, proposed the idea of punctuated equilibrium. This is a theory that we will examine in more detail in Chapter 11, but it's useful to introduce it here because it helps us to understand why our genes may lag behind changes in society. The theory of punctuated equilibrium says that evolution proceeds by long periods of relative quiescence and stability, punctuated by short periods of rapid change. The disappearance of the dinosaurs marks such a punctuation point. They dominated the planet for 130 million years, then, zap! Either they disappeared when a comet hit the Earth and set off eruptions of sulfuric volcanoes that left a persistent cloud of sulfuric dust, or perhaps, more plausibly, they gradually evolved into birds. Either way, it was quite a change. Man's infrequent punctuations and the theory of evolutionary psychology. Business, society, and technology seem to operate via punctuated equilibrium, although on a different timescale. Karl Marx divided history into three phases: feudalism, capitalism, and socialism, and hypothesized that the transition from the second to the third would be rapid. More conventional historians point to just two punctuation points during the whole of human history: the transition from hunter-gatherer Stone Age society to that of agriculture, and the relatively recent shift to an urban industrial society. The basic thesis goes like this: humans emerged as hunter-gatherers, living in clans about 200,000 years ago, and evolved traits suited to that life. Then, a mere 7,000 years ago, agriculture developed, leading to a totally different society. A little over 200 years ago, industry and commerce began to prevail over agriculture. The conditions of human life were utterly transformed. Before the 18th century, nearly everyone lived on the land, with malnutrition a constant threat. The main sources of power were the horse and cart, and human brawn. We forget the extremity and recency of our shift to an urban and generally prosperous society that harnesses machine and brain power. So, our conditions of life have changed radically since the Stone Age. But we haven't. Evolutionary psychologists contend that we are still hardwired with the same circuits that were functional for clan-living hunter-gatherers. We are geared for living in the Stone Age. Why? Because 7,000 years, and certainly 200-odd years, is just not long enough for human evolution to produce genetic traits that match the new surroundings. As Edmund O. Wilson comments, the culture of Kalahari hunter-gatherers is very distinct from that of modern-day Parisians, but the differences are primarily a result of divergence in history and environment, and are not genetic in origin. In what ways are we still prisoners of the Stone Age? Evolutionary psychologists say that our emotions take precedence over our reason. We incorrigibly exhibit primitive behavior. We go by first impressions, beat our breasts, develop clans, dislike outsiders, follow the herd, gossip, construct informal hierarchies, follow confident leaders unthinkingly, and, I said it was controversial, live up to sexual stereotypes. We may know that these behaviors are primitive and often harmful to ourselves and those around us. We may understand, intellectually, that these actions belong to the Stone Age, not to the global world of 21st century business. But we just can't help ourselves. We're hardwired to be what our genes make us. Stone Age animals. Many scientists scorn evolutionary psychology, yet it already has an impressive body of evidence behind it. The points that it makes about business life are very resonant and useful. The Neurology of Stone Age Man. We may summarize the apparently immutable characteristics of humans according to evolutionary psychology under 4 headings. They are: 1. Dominance of emotion over reason. 2. Predictable primitive behavior. 3. Avoidance of risk. And 4. Mad scrambling when under serious threat. Now let's take a look at each of them. The dominance of emotion over reason. Alert instincts were literally vital on the savanna plain, and later during the Ice Age on the Mammoth Steppe. Hunter-gatherers were exposed to predatory, short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats, lions, and wolves, enemies that might raid them, and weather that might flood, freeze, or bake them. Good instincts saved lives. Those with good instincts passed on more of their genes, and instincts became honed for survival. Emotions were, and are, the first reaction to everything seen or sensed. So, evolutionary psychologists contend, when we receive feedback, especially if it has a negative element, our natural disposition is not to think about it. Instead, we react emotionally. We react to people the same way. Do I like her? Not, is she valuable to the company? Nor even, can she be useful to me? We are easily manipulated, even when we realize it, because warm emotion is so much more important to us than cool reason. Predictably primitive behavior. Cooperation, sharing, specialization, and friendliness. One highly functional aspect of the hunter-gatherer was the disposition to live in fairly large groups and to cooperate with the rest of the clan. Homo sapiens emerged as a highly social animal, a bit like hyenas and lions, only much more so. Successful Stone Age people lived in large clans, containing up to 150 people, according to Robin Dunbar, a psychologist at the University of Liverpool. Professor Dunbar also tells us that the larger the troop size in primates, the larger the brain. Anthropologists have found that, even among primitive societies, the richer and more developed ones had a greater number of roles. Sharing food was the basis for cooperative exchange among hunter-gatherers. The humans who survived and prospered and passed on their genes were skilled at cooperating peacefully and at exchange. The division of labor appears to have occurred right back in the Stone Age. One man would make spears, another knew how to hunt game, a third was an expert spear thrower. This supposition is supported by evidence about modern hunter-gatherers, for example the Ache of Paraguay, who are still hunter-gatherers. Some men specialize in finding armadillos in their burrows, others in digging them out. Virtually all hunter-gatherer tribes exhibit sexual specialization. Men hunt, women gather. According to Matt Ridley, women are more verbal, observant, meticulous, and industrious, skills that suit gathering. It has been suggested, however, that humans also benefit from substantial similarity between men and women, allowing cooperation and substitution of tasks, an evolutionary advantage denied species such as spiders, where males and females are dissimilar, or moose or walruses, where the genders lead largely separate lives. The animals hunted were big, and successful hunts might be infrequent, and it therefore made good sense to share the kill throughout the clan. Sharing reduced the risk of going hungry because other hunters would reciprocate, at little cost, since there was plenty for everyone. Cooperation, specialization, and trade require friendliness. In the Stone Age, good guys finished first. Social skills, a propensity to trade information, to barter and do reciprocal favors, all these attributes are, to a greater or lesser degree, hardwired in us. The friendly modern organization, which shares its largesse throughout the employee group, may therefore be going with the grain of human nature. It's good that we're programmed to cooperate, to be loyal and committed to each other, to be friendly to customers and collaborators. Although a large organization with many different types of employees may end up paying the less skilled more than it needs to. Worse, we find it difficult to deliver bad news, to measure each individual's contribution accurately, or to remove passengers. Perhaps we are wired to favor equal treatment and fair shares for all above efficiency and meritocracy. On the whole, however, Stone Age friendliness and cooperation are highly appropriate to modern business. The same cannot be said of our other primitive characteristics. Stereotyping on first impressions. Evolutionary psychologists say that because the Stone Age world was threatening and complex, it was necessary to classify things immediately on the most basic data. Which berries could be eaten or would poison you? Which regions were good for hunting? Which strangers could you trust? And how could you decide? The only basis could be stereotypes based on first impressions. If people looked okay and acted friendly, they could probably be trusted. If not, they were probably enemies. Anthropologists have found non-literate tribes that have classified every plant and animal in a similar way. This supports the view that successful Stone Age genes contained superior ability to make quick and mainly accurate decisions on first impressions. Sitting around to analyze the data was not life-enhancing. Today it is not so vital to decide instantly. Whether Jill is a good person to hire does not have to be decided in the first 15 seconds of her initial interview. If we've scheduled an hour-long meeting to discuss a potential joint venture, we don't have to make our decision in the first minute. Yet research shows that we give enormous weight to first impressions. In turn, our immediate reactions affect the confidence and empathy returned by the people we meet, which reinforce our first impressions. The cycle is only likely to be broken if the other person says something with which we strongly disagree. As good salespeople know, a winning smile, a firm but not too firm handshake, and a good opening line can be more important than the intrinsic characteristics of what is for sale. It is highly probable that we make poor decisions or fail to weigh the evidence judiciously because of our Stone Age programming. We also waste the time we have. If we're going to go on first impressions, we might as well keep all meetings down to 5 minutes long. Breastbeating and mindless optimism. When life is random and terrifying, The person who appears least terrified and most confident is likely to attract followers, food, and sex. Genes for confidence are likely to proliferate and be reinforced. Confidence becomes more highly valued and widespread than realism. In the Stone Age, therefore, breastfeeding was not just an indulgence. It led to success. The business world also responds to confidence. Yet although a mix of self-confidence, skill, and luck can take someone a very long way, outside events often withdraw their cooperation. British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, in the period when he apparently walked on water and was dubbed Supermac after his contemporary Superman, was asked what he feared. He was wise enough to reply, "Events, dear boy, events." And so it proved, in the form of his minister John Profumo, who had an affair with a prostitute and lied about it to Macmillan and, horror of horrors, to the House of Commons. How often has this pattern been repeated in business, with the most confident and successful leaders suddenly dragged down by events, especially when success has made the leader and the people around him or her blind to reality? Yet to temper confidence with realism may be offensive to our genes. In terms of results, blind confidence ain't what it used to be, nor are egotism and breastfeeding. They used to impress. Now, they merely annoy. Our environment has changed. We haven't. A taste for hierarchy. Everything known about hunter-gatherer societies suggests that ad hoc hierarchies flourished. The desire to follow confident leaders and to find security in a chain of status relationships seems to be pronounced traits of primitive societies. Wealth was fluid and not easily accumulated, but food, shelter, and sex gravitated to the leaders. For those who were not the leaders, the chances of security and an adequate living increased with attachment or deference to a leader. Herbert Simon, an economist and cybernetics expert, claims that docility in early humans was the route to survival. By docility, he means receptivity to social influence and the claims of leaders. If we are wired for hierarchy, this helps to explain why every revolutionary attempt to dispense with hierarchy, whether the French or Russian revolutions, or the modern flat single-status organization, ends up replicating new forms of hierarchy. The 20th century was both the century of the common man and the century of the psychopathic leader, with more than 100 million people killed by the top three psychopaths, Stalin, Hitler, and Mao, alone. Even in liberal democratic society and humanistic organizations, if official hierarchy is abolished, unofficial pecking orders spring up and flourish. Status is both sought and acknowledged. The quote at the start of Robert Townsend's 1970 satire titled Up the Organization reminds us, "And God created the organization and gave it dominion over man." Genesis chapter 1, verse 30a, subparagraph 8. The enduring taste for hierarchy may appear to be an anachronism in the age of the knowledge worker. Evolutionary psychology helps to explain why hierarchy is devilishly difficult to extirpate. Of course, the extent to which hierarchy fosters or hinders business success is very much a matter of opinion. I discuss this issue in Chapter 9, and the view I take is that hierarchy is sometimes extremely useful when the boss has some genuine insight about business that is not generally shared. Hierarchy without insight, on the other hand, subtracts value. Most successful organizations manage to combine dictatorship of ends with democracy of means. Evolutionary psychology suggests that the latter is more difficult to engineer than the former. Conformism and herding. Allied to hierarchy is the tendency for the clan to conform internally and be suspicious of those outside. High-status individuals are imitated. There is a natural tendency to do what the hierarchy wants. A sense of identification within the clan leads to cohesive behavior in the face of external threat. The individuals who thrived within any society were either leaders or docile followers, and the societies that thrived were those with the greatest internal cohesion. Conformity paid. Conformity is still in the ascent. Apart from the hundreds of millions of people who followed the 20th century psychopaths, at least partly because everyone else was doing so, we have only to look at the strength of successive conformist ideologies: socialism, imperial jingoism, anti-Semitism, McCarthyism, fundamentalist religions of all kinds, and at least harmful but equally absurd fashions such as kipper ties, flared jeans, the worship of rock stars or football teams, political correctness, or the excesses of both bull and bear stock markets, to realize that following the herd is as popular as ever. This is familiar in organizations too. It takes a brave, foolish, or unusually obstinate person to go against the received wisdom in any unit or firm. Remember William White's 1956 business bestseller titled The Organization Man? And from 1970, Robert Townsend's third paragraph jolts the reader. In the average company, the boys in the mailroom, the president, the vice president, and the girls in the steno pool have three things in common. They are docile, they are bored, and they are dull. Trapped in the pigeonholes of organization charts, they've been made slaves to the rules of private and public hierarchies that run mindlessly on and on, because nobody can change them. 30 years later, and after billions of dollars spent on gurus, consultants, and change programs, not much has altered. The management magazine The Antidote commented in 1999, "The organization built on the industrial model was sabotaging its own efforts to get more initiative out of its people. Despite an ever-expanding toolkit, best practices, and what have you, research found that managers were disillusioned with these attempts at fine-tuning yesterday's model. Most of the core beliefs associated with the industrial model and organization man proved highly resistant to change." Richard Pascal argues persuasively that a key weakness of most large organizations is their inability to tolerate and harness questioning and conflict. In his book, titled Managing on the Edge: How the Smartest Companies Use Conflict to Stay Ahead, Pascal estimates that half the time that contention arises, its potential value is lost because the conflict is smoothed over and avoided. Organizations are thus able to ignore important aspects of reality. Hostility to outgroups. The strength of the clan and its conformity, and the flip side of hostility to those outside. This, too, assisted survival, as Charles Darwin noted. He wrote, "A tribe including many members who, from possessing in high degree the spirit of patriotism, fidelity, obedience, courage, and sympathy, were always ready to aid one another and to sacrifice themselves for the common good, would be victorious over other tribes. And this would be natural selection." Matt Ridley's study of primitive man leads him to a similar conclusion. He writes, "It is a rule of evolution that the more cooperative societies are, the more violent the battles between them. We, humans, may be among the most collaborative social creatures on the planet, but we are also the most belligerent. Experience suggests that only trade and the weakening of exclusive national identities can lead to peace. Around the world, war continues despite the objective truth that conquering territory is no longer a sensible or necessary way to get rich. Our desire for group identity and bloody conflict with rival groups both persist, especially among young people, and are sublimated into demonstrations, football team rivalry, and at another level, into business competition. Yet even within business, what are we to make of the demonization of certain competitors, or the preposterously popular military analogies? John Kay points out that we talk about the Cola Wars, and yet that not in Pepsi's wildest fantasies does it imagine that the conflict will end in the second burning of Atlanta, Coca-Cola's head office. Business competition, happily, is not at all like war. In war, the biggest combatant usually wins by destroying the opposition. In business, two or more competitors can flourish, and it is much more effective to avoid direct competition than to try to inflict direct damage on the competitor, a strategy that is rarely used and sometimes counterproductive even then. In business, there is a third party, the customer, who decides which competitor will win. There is no such powerful third force in war. The idea that business is like war is so stupid that we can only explain the appeal of the analogy, like the continued appeal of war itself, by reference to our descent from the Stone Age man, when belligerent, macho, and destructive behavior paid off. Neolithic habits die hard. Cohesion within a function, division, or team is easy to build. But how often does manufacturing have a close relationship with marketing, or vice versa? The persistence of ancient rivalries should make us wonder whether an organization composed of several cohesive groups may not always be less effective, other things being equal, than one comprising a single, homogeneous group. The avoidance of risk. Evolutionary psychologists say that hunter-gatherers tended to take risks only when their world was falling apart. Their thesis is that our origins explain why today we are risk-averse when we can afford risk, and yet risk-takers when losses are endemic. A high degree of security is necessary before we will take risks. This can be seen in the behavior of infants. Experiments in child psychology show that toddlers dare to explore only when their mothers are around. For hunter-gatherers, these conditions of security were rarely obtained. As long as they had about enough food and shelter, they wouldn't go hunting again until absolutely necessary. The risk of losing everything was just too great. Being eaten by a lion or attacked by one's prey can't have been an attractive risk to court deliberately. Because hunter-gatherers weren't secure, they generally avoided risk. Now, we are often much more secure than the hunter-gatherers, yet we are still loath to take risks, even when these are far from life-threatening. A decision to leave a good corporate home, or to take a very different job within an existing firm, or to seek out different sorts of customers, or even to challenge the boss, may not in fact be very risky. Other ways of making our living are usually possible, yet we perceive the risks to be greater than they really are. Quite possibly, this reluctance to take risks is a hangover from the Stone Age. Risk aversion is built into most modern business. We talk about a risk premium, where returns must be significantly higher to justify taking an extra risk. The concept is curious, given that the most important investors can afford to take risks and can diversify their portfolios or hedge to keep risk within acceptable bounds. Therefore, within certain limits, they should only care about the rate of return, not the risk-adjusted return. And if risk can be diversified away by holding a portfolio of investments, why should above-average volatility require a risk premium? There is a similar paradox in relation to equities and bonds, which are fixed interest instruments. In the 20th century, equities gave about a 6% higher rate of annual return than bonds, because equities were thought to be riskier. Yet the actual risk of equities not matching the return on bonds for any 10-year period was negligible. In fact, the risk of getting an inferior return was nearly always greater for bonds than for equities. Only an atavistic aversion to apparent risk can explain the paradox. It is difficult for us to appreciate that uncertainty is not necessarily risky in any real sense. Uncertainty can actually be very reliable. Few businesses have such high and consistent returns as casinos. Placing a large number of bets, which is what the casino owners do, need not be very risky. There is a false market in risk. Because we are risk-averse, risk premiums are higher than they should be. Individual entrepreneurs take risks, it is true, but generally only when convinced that the upside greatly exceeds the downside in both quantum and probability. Organizations and those in them are notoriously reluctant to take real risks, despite evidence that, increasingly, business fortune goes to the brave. In high-growth markets, especially those involving networks, you have to place big bets to stand a good chance of winning. Upfront investment can be very high because fixed costs are very high. Risk is also high because each business segment will only support one substantial winner. But, equally, incremental costs are generally low, and sometimes virtually zero, on occasions actually negative. The rewards from success can be astronomical and quite disproportionate to the cost, even to the total cost of all the contenders, winners and losers. There is usually a first-mover advantage, and the first player to establish a significant lead, not necessarily the first mover, will usually be able to sustain its lead and go even further ahead. For an individual player, therefore, the risk of a low investment can actually be much higher than the risk of a high investment. The sensible choice is often between making a large bet and making no bet at all. Writer Thomas A. Stewart, editor of Fortune magazine, advises firms not to try to avoid risk. He says that managing knowledge products is like holding a book of innovative bets. Companies should maintain a portfolio of ideas in which risk is both maximized and diversified. Don't put all your eggs in one basket, but do bet heavily. Mad scramble when under serious threat. Primitive man did take risks and scramble furiously when his life was at stake. Panic often worked. The more successful scramblers survived more often, so that scrambling under threat is part of our genetic makeup. Today, such scrambling behavior may not be so functional. When non-specific layoffs are announced, so that no one knows whether they'll keep their job, productivity often rises sharply. When a factory closes, certain employees may become hysterical or aggressive. When a normally sane person is under pressure while driving, road rage or sudden panic may take over. Higher productivity, screaming at managers, and attacking a fellow motorist are all examples of mad scrambling when threatened, but certainly the last two behaviors, and possibly the first, don't help the scrambler at all. The modern world is not the savannah plain. Another interesting example is gambling. Those who win modestly in a casino usually want to cash in their chips before long. Gamblers who start to lose often go beyond their preset limit of losses and gamble everything they have available in a mad scramble to get back to where they started. On the stock market, individual investors often display similar behavior. When their shares rise, they want to lock in the profit. If the shares fall heavily, novices will nearly always hang on in an effort to avoid serious loss. They may even scramble to get funds enabling them to average down by buying more of the same shares at a lower price. Yet professional investors are trained to take the opposite approach. It normally pays to run your gains and cut your losses, not to fight the market. Trading houses and fund managers often have strict rules to enforce such behavior. They need to, because human nature tends in the opposite direction. When we are losing badly, we are quite likely to gamble wildly. This was why Barings Bank was brought to its knees by rogue trader Nick Leeson. Further insight into our irrational attitudes to what we own, what we risk, and what we deserve are available from conventional psychology, biology, and game theory. I've picked 3 examples that are important for business and that illuminate, and to a degree corroborate, some findings from evolutionary psychology. Owners and intruders. One fascinating insight from both biology and game theory relates to contests between owners or incumbents of territory and challengers or intruders. Being the owner confers a psychological advantage that is independent of relative strength. If 2 similar butterflies contest a sunny spot, they spiral around for a short time and then, typically, the intruder departs. But if both butterflies are already resident in the spot, the contest takes quite some time, with an equal chance of either winning. Experiments with baboons show the same pattern. The owner is likely to win, even if it is the slightly weaker animal. The reason is a strong inclination to hang on to what one already has, and a weaker inclination to take new ground. The endowment effect. Similar experiments on humans have shown what psychologists call the endowment effect. Say that someone has been offered 2 tickets to a top sporting event. A few days later, she is offered $200 for the tickets. In experiments, most refuse the exchange. Put the experiment in reverse. Give the same subject $200 and then offer the same tickets in exchange for the money. What do you think happens? Apparently, perversely, most still refuse the trade. But the idea of ownership explains the apparent paradox. What people are given first, and hence what they own, is what they want to keep. Game theory, which we'll talk about in Chapter 5, has validated the ownership advantage. In games of owners and intruders, there is a dominant strategy that in the long run will win most games. If you are the owner, you should escalate to deter the intruder. If you are the intruder, you should not escalate. In fact, if the owner escalates, you should retreat. An owner should make a stand, because the intruder is then likely to retreat. When players swap roles, the same phenomenon occurs. The owner, previously the retreating intruder, tends to escalate and win, and the new intruder, previously the fearless owner, retreats. Eminent biologist John Maynard Smith called this pattern bourgeois competition, since respect for property rights ensures that conflict is not escalated. Bourgeois competition is implicit cooperation with consent given to incumbents. Clearly, this is useful knowledge in business. There is an inbuilt, apparently hardwired genetic bias towards respect for incumbents that places challengers at a disadvantage. This bias is probably related to the risk aversion noted previously. When hunter-gatherers had enough, they would not fight for more because it was too risky, but they would scramble to defend what they already had because this was vital for their security. Now, there is no objective basis for our behavior, but it still reflects Stone Age conditions. Consider these corollaries. 1. The so-called first mover advantage, the well-documented tendency for the first firm into a market to enjoy an advantage usually greater than it deserves on objective merit alone, independent of being first, may be rooted as much in the psychology of the challenger and the incumbent as it is in the effect on customers. The conventional explanation for first mover advantage is that customers associate the new niche with the first firm into it. Obviously, not much can be done about this by the challenger. If, however, much of the advantage resides purely in the mind game between challenger and incumbent, the advantage may not be as secure as it seems. If the incumbent can somehow psych itself up to an absolute determination to take the territory, and make it clear to the incumbent that it is no respecter of bourgeois rights, then the odds may shift significantly in its favor. 2. Under current behavior, however, if the incumbent and challenger are otherwise equally matched, the incumbent enjoys a clear advantage, if only in terms of motivation. If the incumbent comes under attack, even from a superior product or service, it should escalate the conflict, knowing that the odds are that the challenger will back down. And finally, 3. Perceived ownership is what matters. It is not relevant which butterfly is the real owner of the sunning glade. The butterfly that considers it belongs there will tend to win over the butterfly that thinks of itself as an intruder. If you want your firm to win in a particular market, therefore, you have to drill into your people that you belong there, that it is rightfully yours. Bending the facts, as long as you do so convincingly, can be very useful. Propaganda can decide the contest. People will not easily concede space that they believe is theirs. On the other hand, they will not put their best foot forward if they think they are trespassing. The ultimatum bargaining game. Robert Frank, an economist interested in explaining why people do things using emotional as well as rational explanations, draws attention to the issue of fairness and the role it plays in negotiations. Psychologists use an experiment called the ultimatum bargaining game. This is a game for two people, say Alex and Justin. Alex is given $500 and told to share it with Justin. If Justin accepts what he's given, they both keep the cash. If Justin refuses the deal, neither gets anything. What should Alex offer Justin? If Alex and Justin are clinically rational and don't allow emotion to creep in, Alex should offer Justin a very small cut, maybe $5, and keep the other $495. After all, Alex has the cash, and Justin has the choice. $5 or nothing. Dr. Spock would certainly advise Justin to accept. The thing is, in experiments where this happens, Justin tends to refuse the $5, and both players go away empty-handed. Apparently, our deep-rooted sense of fairness is offended by the inequality of the split, so that Justin looks at the proportion he's getting, rather than the absolute amount. Not only that, in practice, Alex doesn't go for the rational solution and offer a small share to Justin. By far the most common outcome in experiments is that the person with the money offers $250, half the cash. Does this behavior reflect the sharing of meat on the savanna plain, where the hunters are thought to have shared with those who didn't participate in the kill? Are generosity and socialistic envy hardwired by natural selection, where evolution has not had time to catch up with modern conditions? At work, do we expect to have to share even where our colleagues have made no contribution? And do the latter get indignant if they don't get a fair chunk of the bonus pool, even if they've personally had a lean year? I've observed this behavior many times when advising bosses who have to decide bonuses. Justin may have brought no profit this year, but we don't want to demotivate him by a derisory bonus. Such thinking is deep-rooted and frustrates the very purpose of meritocratic rewards. I believe that large organizations are inevitably socialistic in that they find it impossible to reward according to just desserts. Instead, big business builds in an undue share of the spoils for the passengers and for those who are not vital. In large multinational corporations, non-core workers, including those engaged in tasks such as cleaning, routine maintenance, or clerical functions, are generally paid substantially more than they would be for the same job outside the multinational, because otherwise the gap between them and their more skilled colleagues would seem too large. The dilemma faced by those who set pay is this: do we reward according to our economic needs and the laws of supply and demand, or do we do what people, wrongly, regard as fair? Large organizations almost always go down the second route. Indeed, one of the reasons that outsourcing is so popular is that it offers a neat way out of the dilemma. If the cleaners and clerks and maintenance workers are outside the organization, we only have to pay them their market rate, however high the compensation of the knowledge workers inside. Are we really hardwired? There are two interesting contemporary scientific challenges to the hardwiring theory. One is the increasing evidence that learned behavior can win out against instinct, that the dominance of our genes is being undermined. The other challenge is from the eminent science of neuroplasticity, which suggests that, far from being hardwired, the brain can be rewired by the mind. The theory of cultural evolution in animals. We came across the first of these challenges in Chapter 2. Biologists, such as Richard Dawkins and E.O. Wilson, have suggested that in human society, learned behavior, think culture, can operate independently of genes. Now, other biologists are going much further and arguing that many other animals, including some very unsophisticated organisms, may exhibit cultural evolution, which often runs directly counter to genetic preferences. Their experimental evidence is fascinating. A Canadian marine biologist, Hal Whitehead, suggests that sperm whales learn songs from their mothers. As we saw in Chapter 2, biologist Lealan Dugatkin has shown that female guppies tend to mate with the male guppies that have already been selected as mates by other females. The females will even switch preferred mates in order to copy other females. Dugatkin shows that learned behavior has invaded the province of genes in marine bugs and many types of birds. His conclusion is, cultural norms may take on a life of their own and run away in very unexpected directions that were never even in the picture for our primitive ancestors roaming the savanna of Africa.